I'm talking today with Professor Angus Deaton from Princeton University. His research spans a wide breadth of economics on poverty, inequality, economic development, consumer behaviour, saving, health and well-being. Recently he's been looking in particular at the determinants of health in rich and poor countries, as well as on the measurement of poverty and inequality in the US, in India and around the world. Among his many honours, Angus is a corresponding Fellow of the British Academy, an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was knighted this year for his services to economics and international affairs, and of course he was a recipient of the 2015 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Angus, welcome.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Angus, your talk is called "Can the Government Make You Happy? Should it Try?" First, can the government make you happy? What does your work show?
My work is concerned with what are the things that do seem to make people happy, and then asking whether some of those are under control of the government, and if they are under the control of the government, whether targeting people's happiness would be a sensible thing for the government to do, also an ethical thing for the government to do. And of course there are long histories going back to Bentham suggesting that targeting aggregate happiness is what governments ought to do.
What things have you found that make people happy?
Well, surprisingly, getting old makes people happy.
Good.
Yeah. So we don't have to worry about aging. You know, aging is just going to do what Bentham wanted us to do automatically, which is as the population gets older, they get happier and happier and much more emotional life. So that's one of the more surprising things.
Tell us about this threshold for happiness that you've found.
Well, we found that at around $75,000, up until that point, your life gets better if you have more money. After that, your day-to-day emotional life doesn't seem to get any better. However, the way you judge your life satisfaction seems to go on increasing beyond that.
You focus on this difference between happiness and life satisfaction. Tell us exactly what the difference is.
Happiness is one of many emotions like sadness or stress or pain. And happiness in the other sense is how you feel your life is going. And it's perfectly possible for you to experience a lot of pain and sadness and yet still think your life is going okay. You could imagine that a favorite uncle had died and you were burying them at the age of 95. They're 95, not you. And you know, you're very sad, but on the other hand, you think he led a good life, you're living a good life. This is all okay. So these two things don't necessarily go together. It's true that above, you know, some limit, it doesn't seem to improve your daily emotional life very much. On the other hand, if you ask people how their life is going, the more money you give them, the happier they seem to be.
And that goes right up, you find that
Seems to. You know, we don't really have data on Bill Gates or even on Donald Trump, but maybe it's true.
Why is it economists are looking at happiness?
Well, I think economists have rightly moved to taking a broader perspective on well-being in general. And so that, you know, they've moved beyond just looking at money and looking at other things that make people's lives worth living. And so they've certainly, I don't think anyone disputes that economists have things to say about health. They have things to say about politics and democracy, and maybe happiness too, why not?
Are there characteristics that make us less happy? I suppose getting younger. But
yeah, unfortunately you can't do that. I'd settle for that. You know, if they
Exactly.
said you can lose 30 years, but you get a little less happy, I'd say, okay, well, I'll take that risk. I think, you know, cutting people off from their friends is a very bad thing for people. Social isolation seems to be very bad for people. There's some more controversial things, like not being religious is pretty bad for people compared with being religious.
But were there any challenges in convincing people, particularly in policy, to take these measurements, this work, seriously?
I think it varies from country to country, and you know, David Cameron was somewhat of a believer in this. Yeah. David Halpern, that used to run the Nudge unit, was very much a believer and helped bring a number of politicians on board with that. So some countries, they're not so very interested in it, but there are a number of governments around the world who are collecting the data. And that's surely a good thing because academics and policymakers and unions and activists can, you know, work with those data and see if they serve a common purpose.
If you had to kind of think of, in this area, what the most pressing research questions are.
One of the philosophical issues is one that was raised a long time ago by Amartya Sen and has really pushed it, which is this question that people may adapt their expectations and their needs to their circumstances. And so if that happens, they may say their life is going great, even though objectively really bad things are happening to them. And how we deal with that, I think, is still up for grabs.
Should the government actually try, I suppose, a little bit, how should it interpret these measures? And is there a role in policy for using them?
The interpretation, I think, is an issue. There's also the issue of what is the proper role of government. There's also an issue which comes up with lots of policies, which is something that may be good on average, may not be good for individuals. And so there's a real issue about whether, you know, if you find that people with kids are happier on average than people without the kids, does that entitle the government to tell everybody they should have kids, for instance?
Oh, so there's some cases where it doesn't look like it's so obvious, but are there some, you know, very positive cases you can think of?
Well, I mean, you know, David Halpern used to give this example that people are really happy if they live by rural post offices, you know, and the people don't know they're going to be happy and if they do that. So you could make a case for the government at least telling people that they would be happy if they lived by a rural post office. The trouble with that in some sense is the people who live near rural post offices are different from people who don't live near rural post office. And that may be what makes them happy. So there's a lot of issues around that, which are fairly familiar to economists, though not to psychologists to the same extent.
Are there cases where it's rather controversial, the way you might think of using happiness or life satisfaction in policy?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think you have to be very, very careful. So for instance, one example would be, you know, if you find that people who live by airports and suffer a lot of noise are just as happy as people who don't, that might be because they're all deaf, for instance, they decide to live there. So what are you actually looking at this point? Or maybe they've been compensated by lower house prices. And so these are, again, issues that economists are very familiar with.
You've said the goal is to improve people's lives, and I think you suggest that you should focus most aggressively on helping those, you know, below this threshold in a way. You talked about friends. Are there other characteristics that?
Well, I think health is terrific. Health is tremendously important to people. It's pretty clear that poverty does screw up your life, and that if you don't have enough money to go out with friends and do things like that. So there's nothing in this. Unemployment is really bad for you. That's been known for a long time. And that's something where the economists sort of said, well, you lose money. If we give them money, it's okay. And it's not okay, or it doesn't seem to be okay. So I think austerity has been really, really bad for people. And there's a whole bunch of things that, and I'm not sure they're not things that people knew anyway, but it does give a certain amount more weight.
What's the key takeaway from this research?
I think that governments need to gather these data. They need to take them seriously. They need to make them available to people. I don't think you should replace everything the government does by targeting happiness, but we need to take these numbers seriously.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
And thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, even on camera.